And you stupid. Get going.
Well, that pretty much sums up what happened in part 1, but if you haven't seen that video, make sure to go check it out. There will be a link in the description and on the end screen of this video. But as for today's episode, I'm going to try to get this car running as it was intended from the factory. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. The first thing I wanted to tackle was the fuel leak. So after getting the car in the garage and putting it up on ramps, I checked underneath the car to see if I could pinpoint where exactly the fuel leak was coming from. And it looked like it was coming from the center of the engine. And after taking a closer look at the engine, I found this. That's a really bad fuel leak coming from one of the injectors, which I just cleaned and replaced the O-rings on in part 1. Maybe I didn't do it correctly, or maybe I didn't notice something. I don't know, but we'll have to take this apart again and figure it out. So first, I started by disconnecting the negative terminal from my battery, and then broke loose the 12 bolts on the intake plenum with my ratchet. I then removed them the rest of the way with my impact gun. Followed by removing the 2 screws that hold the map sensor to its bracket, and then putting the map sensor to the side. And using a pair of pliers to squeeze apart this clamp, I also removed this hose, as well as the air intake hose. Next up was removing the coolant line, because I'm dumb and completely forgot that it wasn't necessary to remove in order to take off the intake plenum. But I did it anyway, and damaged my TPS sensor in the process. But something that is necessary to remove are the 2 nuts from either side of the EGR tube. I ended up trying to remove the 2 that were on the EGR valve. The reason I said trying to remove them is because I ended up breaking one off and somehow rounding off the other one. Yeah, so after having a very polite and PG conversation with the EGR valve and the bolts, I just ended up removing the entire thing. So anyways, it was at this point I realized I didn't need to remove that coolant line and remembered it's 10 times easier just to remove the 2 bolts from the throttle body. With the throttle body now free, I could finally take off the intake plenum. Now I have access to the fuel rail, so using my wrench, I undid the fuel lines from the rail. Once that was out of the way, I then took a flathead screwdriver and then removed all 6 retaining clips, and the electrical connectors from the fuel rail. I then removed the vacuum line from the fuel pressure regulator, and the 2 bolts securing the fuel rail to the manifold. After that, I removed the cold start fuel line from the opposite side of the rail. And now, the fuel rail is free. So I went ahead and wiggled it out. And after inspecting it, I found this. It's really hard to see on here, but the cap on this one injector is broken in half. Here, let me show you once I took it off. You see how the cap looks fine on this side? And as soon as I turn it, you can see where it was broken off. Okay, so now that we know what the issue is, let's go ahead and fix this. If you recall in part 1, I said I already ordered new injectors, and they are here, but we'll get to that later in the video. But first, I wanted to take apart this fuel rail and clean everything up, as well as replace all the seals. So let's start by removing these 3 bolts so we can get to one of the seals we need to replace. There's one. There's the second. And the third. Next, I remove the 6 tamper-proof screws from the fuel pressure regulator cap. And now I can remove it. And remove the fuel pressure regulator from the cap. And as you can see, there's rust everywhere. And the regulator looks like it has never been replaced. But luckily, I have a new one. So with that off, it was now time to remove the injectors. So using a flathead screwdriver and turning the locking clips the opposite direction, I wiggled out all 6 injectors. With all of them out, I wanted to clean up this fuel rail and the other rusted parts. And the way I did this was by placing them in a vinegar bath overnight. I also put in some of my rusted tools that I needed to clean up. And as you can see, the vinegar is just eating up that rust. And while they were soaking in there, I needed something else to do while I waited. So then I went back to the car and decided I'm going to replace the fuel filter. So I jacked up the car, got underneath, and started unbolting the strap holding the fuel filter in place. Then, using an adjustable wrench and one of the appropriate size, I broke loose the fuel lines and then unscrewed them the rest of the way. I also made sure to have something ready to catch the fuel that was about to come pouring out. Now I can remove the old fuel filter and install this brand new one. So I screwed the new filter back in by hand and then connected the rusted old fuel lines and tightened everything up. Then I put the old rusted screw back in the strap and screwed that back in place to secure the filter. And it was at this point that I realized I'm already under here. Might as well replace the fuel lines too. So I broke the fuel line loose one more time and removed it the rest of the way by hand. And as for the other one, I loosened up the clamp first and then tried pulling it out of the rubber too, only to realize that it's in the strap for the fuel filter. So I undid that bolt again and opened up the strap. And then, using a wrench in one hand to push the rubber piece up, I pulled the fuel line down with my other hand. Now that that was free, I just had to remove this one bolt in order to open up the bracket and release the fuel lines from it. With the fuel lines now free, it was time to go back to the engine bay and push them down through. However, for whatever reason, that just wasn't happening. So instead of struggling for another hour trying to push them down or pull them up, I just cut both lines in half and pulled one half of the lines up and as for the other half, I pulled them from underneath the car. Now, since there's no point in installing these new lines now, considering the fuel rail and the other components are being cleaned, I'm going to leave these lines for later and we're going to go check out the clean components. And as you can see, the fuel rail looks a lot better, as well as the straighter valve block, the cap for the fuel pressure regulator, the metal seal for the cap, the 6 locking clips for the injectors, the 3 screws for the block, the 6 tamper-proof screws for the cap, and the 6 locking clips for the injector wires. Everything looks pretty much brand new, so I'm just going to roll this paper towel over it and let these dry for a day. I also made sure to blow out the entire fuel rail with compressed air just to make sure everything was 100% dry. With this drying for a day and having nothing else to do, I decided to clean up and restore anything I can get to. So I started by removing the bolts for the upper intake. And an easy trick you can do in order to not break these bolts is to loosen them up a bit and then tighten them back down. Do that a couple times and you should be able to unbolt these bolts without any issues. After taking all the bolts out, I very carefully removed the upper intake. And then I tried to remove the gasket in one piece, but it was so old and brittle that it just ended up breaking in multiple places. And after I removed the upper intake, I went ahead and unbolted the 6 bolts for the valve cover, removed the PCV valve, and then took off the valve cover. And yeah, it looked really nasty in there. I also took off the gasket, which just broke in half, but not to worry, I do have new ones. But this is what was underneath that valve cover. Yeah, I'm gonna need to clean that up a bit. I also took off the valve cover in the back, and then proceeded to clean both for what approximately took me 3 hours to do. I just cleaned them with some soapy water and a brass bristle brush. And after I was done cleaning them, I also cleaned the upper intake using a brass wheel on my drill. And when that was done, it came out looking like this. I still needed to clean some of these small grooves, but I did that off camera. So now, I got my pressure washer out and started washing everything that was going to be restored. I should mention, it was about 8 degrees and absolutely freezing outside. But anyways, I made sure everything was hit with the pressure washer, all while I was completely drenching my shoes and socks with the freezing cold water. So I kept having to go in and out of my house to make sure my feet didn't get frostbite. And as you can see here, I tried to come back out to the garage to degrease everything with soap and water, wearing my flip-flops, because wearing my shoes and socks and getting them soaking wet again just seemed like the worst idea. And unfortunately, I just could not stand the cold anymore, so I called it a night. The next day, it was about 30 degrees, so I finished washing everything, including the intake plenum, and once everything was cleaned off, I let that dry for a day, and then hung it up on some metal wire. I then got some citrus-scented paint stripper and generously covered the intake plenum and the 2 valve covers. I let it do its thing overnight, but came back down in about an hour to check the progress. It seemed like it was working just fine, so I let that sit overnight and came back the next day. And as you can see, the paint looks stripped off. So then I put some gas in my pressure washer, flipped the switch to on, pulled out the choke to start, and pulled the cord. I then pushed the choke back in to run. I then thoroughly tried to wash all the paint off of everything. With the intake plenum done, now it was time to do the valve covers. And as you can see, the paint stripper and pressure washer did an awesome job. And yes, my feet were freezing, but I still had to clean up this mess I made. So using my shop vac, I vacuumed up all the removed paint. Next, I brought the parts into my kitchen and began cleaning the rest of the paint off. I also made sure to degrease and scuff everything with a maroon scuff pad and some dish soap. And when everything was cleaned up and dry, this is what it looked like. Now, it's time for the fun part. Masking. Yay, masking. So fun. I started by laying down strips of tape on the valve cover. And then using an X-Acto knife to cut out the shape of the valve cover. This process was very time consuming. To mask everything took me about an hour, and once this valve cover was finished, I moved on to the next one and just repeated the process. I then masked off the intake plenum, making sure to cover all the vacuum fittings and the gasket surfaces. I then did the same thing to the upper intake, and once that was finished, here's what everything looked like all masked up. Now, it was time to paint. I hung everything back up and wiped it all down with a microfiber towel and some isopropyl rubbing alcohol. And while that dried, I went to my kitchen, turned on the hottest water from my sink, and poured it into, I'm not even sure what you would call this, an open jar? Anyways, I then got my spray paint, shook it up a little, and then placed it into the hot water. I did this so I can decrease the chances of orange peel in the freezing cold weather. And after letting it sit for 10 minutes, I poured some water out and then went downstairs. I then took that can out and put another one in just in case I run out while painting. I then took a towel and wiped the can down, making sure there was no water on it, and then proceeded to shake the can up for about a minute. And now it was time to start painting. So this is the first coat of primer. Now some of you may have noticed I am not using the high heat paint that was shown in the previous clip, and that's because I've used this stuff before on other engine parts and have never had any issues. And some of you may have also noticed that the masking tape is now white instead of yellow. Well, that's because this is the second time I'm painting these. Because the first time I painted them, this happened. Yeah, this sucked. I had to redo everything all over again. I didn't have to strip the paint off the intake plenum and the other valve cover, but it wasn't the yellow I wanted it to be. It ended up looking more like a neon green color. So yeah, back to adding primer. With the first coat of primer now done, I let that dry for 10 minutes and then added a second. I then let that sit for another 10 minutes and applied my third and final coat. Now it was time for the base coat, so after shaking the can up for a minute, I started laying down the first coat of Rust-Oleum Sunburst Yellow. And once the intake plenum was done, I moved on to the two valve covers and applied my first coat to them as well. I also added the first coat of VHT's cast aluminum silver to the upper intake. I let everything dry for 10 minutes and went back and applied the second coat, making sure to go a little heavier with this one and get paint in all of the grooves. I then let that sit for another 10 minutes and applied my third and final coat. With the final coat of base applied, I let everything sit overnight. The next day, I very carefully sanded the paint off the raised surfaces on the intake plenum and on the valve covers. And yes, I know I could have just masked off the raised surfaces on the valve cover and the intake plenum, but this seemed to be a lot easier and faster of a method for me. And once all three objects were sanded down, they came out looking like this. Now, it's time to add the clear coat. And for that, I'm going to be using Spray Max's 2K Clear. Now, when using this product, you absolutely must wear a respirator. I can't stress that enough. I even added a paper towel in mine just because this stuff is so strong. I also made sure all my windows were open and closed all the air vents so it doesn't spread to the rest of the house. After all my safety concerns were addressed, I started laying down the first coat of clear. And once that was finished, I let it dry for 10 minutes and then continued on with the second coat. And after another 10 minutes of letting it dry, I applied the third and final coat of clear. And now I just have to let this dry overnight. But everything came out looking great this time. I absolutely love this yellow color. And while I let that dry, I went back and started reassembling the cleaned up fuel rail. First, I removed the Schrader valve from the block. I then took off the old seal, and then added the new seal and hand tightened the Schrader valve back to the block. Then I used a wrench to tighten it down the rest of the way. Next, I got the new fuel rail to block seal, put the 3 screws in, and placed it down on the fuel rail and tightened that up as well. I then placed the new fuel pressure regulator onto the rail along with the cap, making sure the vacuum line was facing the correct direction, and then screwed down all 6 tamper-proof screws. Now, it was time to install the brand new injectors. I ended up installing 5 of the 6 injectors because the 6th one wasn't the correct injector, and that's because the locking clip groove on this injector only goes halfway around, so the clip couldn't lock in place. You see how on the injector on the left the groove for the clip goes all the way around, and the one on the right doesn't? So yeah, they sent me the wrong injector. But after contacting the seller, he ended up sending me the correct one, and while I waited for that to come, I went ahead and removed the masking tape for the parts I painted. With that out of the way, everything painted was ready to be put back on the engine. But first, I had to clean up the engine a bit from all the oil and sludge. So using some brake clean, a brass bristle brush, some paper towels, and compressed air, I got rid of 99% of this sludge. And then use some new oil to lubricate everything. After that, I used a plastic scraper and a brass bristle brush to clean up the gasket mating surfaces for both valve covers. I also cleaned up the gasket surface for the intake, and after all the surfaces were cleaned, I then added some black RTV to the split lines between the cylinder head and the intake manifold. Then I went back downstairs and installed new Felpro gaskets to the valve covers. I then followed that up by placing the valve covers back on the engine. I hand tightened down all 12 bolts, and then using my new torque wrench, I torqued all of them down to spec. Next, I removed the paper towels I used to fill the holes, placed down a new gasket, and aligned the upper intake. I then hand tightened down all the bolts, and it was at this point that I realized that some of my vacuum lines were broken. So now I had to order a new set of vacuum lines. So I went ahead and plugged the upper intake holes and waited for the new vacuum lines to come in. When they arrived, I tried installing them only to realize that there needed to be some adjustment to them. and that the stock rubber spacers would not work with these new lines. So I had to make my own. I ended up using zip ties, looping the first set around the vacuum lines, and then using some yellow zip ties to make the spacers between the lines. And this is how everything came out when it was all done. Not too bad. Now it was time to install the new lines. And after about 20 minutes of bending the lines to shape, we got all the vacuum lines in. They're all connected except the one for the, you can see over there, the one for the EGR, because I have to put on the new EGR. And then over here we have the one that goes to the intake plenum, the one that goes to the fuel pressure regulator, and this one goes underneath the intake plenum. This is from the PCV valve, or PVC, I'm not sure which one it is. I keep forgetting because I keep hearing both things. And then there's this one here that goes into the map sensor. But we'll plug that in later when I attach the intake plenum. So I guess what's next to do? I'm going to try and somehow squeeze this pipe into the PCV, into the grommet here. So I haven't been able to get it in all the way. I struggled for hours, but on the Fiero Facebook group they said I should try heating up the grommet, so I'm going to try heating it up with a heat gun and then trying to slide it in. As the Fiero Facebook group said, let's heat up that grommet. And now, let's try sticking that pipe into that really tight hole. Oh, it went in. Whew. Now that the pipe is back in, I'm going to tighten this bracket down. And with that tightened down, I'm going to torque down the upper intake bolts to 15 pound-feet of torque. Okay, so a little bit of an issue. The bolts are supposed to be torqued down to 15 foot-pounds or pound-feet of torque. However, the torque wrench that I bought, this is the inch-pounds one, this is not the foot-pounds one. But the torque wrench that I bought that is foot-pounds goes down to 25 foot-pounds, so it does not go down to 15. However, 180 inch-pounds is equal to 15 foot-pounds, so I'm going to use my inch-pound torque instead to torque them down. And I should mention, there is a torque sequence that you have to go by, as you can see here. This is the front of the intake. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we're going to follow that, and we're going to torque this down. First, let me set my torque wrench to 180 inch-pounds. So with that info, I set my torque wrench to 180 inch-pounds and torqued all the bolts down. Okay, so if you're going to do this to your engine, the torque sequence is as follows. From the front of the engine, it's first, second, third, fourth, fifth right here, sixth, the one right here, seventh, if you can see it, and then the one over here, the last one, is eighth. That's the torque sequence, and it's at 15 pound-feet of torque. Alright, well, that's done. Now what I need to do is install the rebuilt fuel rail. But if you remember, one of the injectors I got was the wrong kind. But the correct one came in, so let's install that. And now, let's go put the rail back on the engine. First, I wanted to clean up any debris that was around the injector holes, so using my finger, I plugged up the holes and blew compressed air around it to get rid of the debris. Then, I took the caps off the injectors and carefully installed the rail. I then hand tightened the 2 bolts, plugged in the line for the fuel pressure regulator, and attached the line for the cold start valve, and tightened that down too. And now it was time to install the new fuel lines. So after wrapping the threads with Teflon tape and adding the new rubber seals, I managed to somehow maneuver one of the lines in place and thread it into the fuel rail. Then I tightened it down with my wrench. And as for the second line, I had to unscrew the bolts from the fuel rail block to get the new line to thread in straight. But once I got it in place, I just tightened the block back down and the fuel line with my wrench. I then slid the other half of the lines down through the engine bay and hand tightened them to the lines from the fuel rail. I then jacked up the car again and placed my jack stands underneath, as well as some ramps for extra security. I then got my 13mm socket and unbolted both of the straps for the fuel tank. I then unbolted the 4 bolts for the support bracket. Removed the bracket and then threaded the 4 bolts back in to keep track of them. I then disconnected all the lines from the tank and dropped the tank and removed it by pulling this piece of cardboard. Now it was time to remove the old sending unit. So using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer, I removed the lock ring and carefully took out the old sending unit and fuel pump. So, out with the old, and in with the brand new fuel pump and sending unit. I carefully installed that back into the tank, and then set the lock ring in place and tapped it down clockwise to lock it in. I then removed the last rusted fuel line, and then installed a brand new stainless steel one. I then fed the new wiring harness back through the firewall and followed that by reinstalling the bracket so it could support the tank while I connected all the lines. After all the lines were connected, I retightened both straps. And now the tank was back in place. And since I already have the car jacked up, I remembered that the starter was skipping when I tried starting the car. So, I went ahead and replaced the old bad starter that did this. And as you can see on the new starter, that's not supposed to happen. The Bendix was broken and wasn't properly engaging with the flywheel. So, I lifted the new starter through this very tight gap and set it in position. I then hand tightened the 2 bolts to hold it in place, and I did also put in the old shim since that's what the manufacturer of this starter recommended. But you can't see me doing any of that because I forgot to reposition the camera. So once that was done, I then connected the 2 wires to the new starter solenoid and hand tightened those down as well. With that being said, it was time to lower the car and get back to the engine bay. I snugged up the 2 new fuel lines that I had previously only hand tightened. And with that being said, that's every fuel component replaced on this car. Now I can plug in all 6 electrical connectors, and then remove the paper towels from the upper intake. Add the 2 new gaskets. Plug in the PCV line to the bottom of the plenum. Align the plenum to make sure it seats properly on the gasket and on the upper intake, and then thread the bolts in by hand to keep everything in place. I then brought over the throttle cable bracket and added the 2 bolts for that as well. I then followed that up by torquing all 12 bolts to 18 pound-feet of torque in the proper sequence. I then added the new gasket for the throttle body to intake plenum connection, and then threaded the 2 bolts in and torqued them down to spec. I also reconnected the throttle and cruise control cables back to the throttle body. I did also do the 3rd cable, but I forgot what that cable was for or what it was called, but I did connect that as well. Next up was reattaching the map sensor to its bracket, then installing the new distributor cap and screwing that back in place. Then I connected all the plug wires to it, making sure that the wires were in the proper firing order. I followed that up by reconnecting the air intake tube, and once that was done, everything was finally back together, with a completely new fuel system and rebuilt fuel rail. So, I added some fuel, and now that I have some fuel in there, I just wanted to mention that off camera, I also replaced every EGR component, including the valve, gaskets, tube, and a rebuilt EGR solenoid, which a fellow Fiero Facebook group member actually sent out to me because they were discontinued. I also replaced the idle air control valve since it was cheap enough and I figured it would help, as well as get new red STI spark plug wires, because 1, they look better, and 2, I don't know the condition of the old ones. So with that info out of the way, I'm gonna go and start her up. Making sure to first prime the fuel system a couple of times since we replaced and rebuilt every fuel component. With the system now primed, I turned the key and she started right up. The check engine light was gone. There was no more popping noise. No more smoke coming from the engine. There was still smoke coming from the exhaust, but that's to be expected in the winter. But she sounded like she was finally ready to hit the road, and that's exactly what I did. And after about 5 miles of driving, I eventually made it to the gas station where I topped her off. And now that she's all filled up, let's start her back up and head back home. Oh, you've gotta be kidding me. The fuel gauge is not working. That means I have to drop the tank again. Yep. I have to drop the tank again. A tank that's now full of gas despite what the gauge shows. But that'll have to be in the next episode, as this episode has already gone way too long in my opinion. Although some of you guys might like the longer episode. There are still some minor issues that need to be addressed, such as the car not being able to shut off. And a minor transmission fluid leak. All of that and more will be addressed in the next episode. So if you guys are enjoying this series, then please leave this episode a like. And if you're new to my channel, then please consider subscribing. So until next time, I've been Cuz, you've been you, and I'll catch you later.